Well, yes, thank you very much for the invitation, and I feel very lucky to be speaking, especially alongside Jim and Joanna, so this is a real treat for me. So I am a psychologist, and what I'm going to do is basically present a series of experiments and try not to get too bogged down into the details of the experiments, but sort of extract general principles that I think are relevant to adding nuance to our understanding of what autonomy means. But what I want to do is start with a little experiment. Being a psychologist, I can do an experiment with you guys here, and I want you to think about a behavior that you have that you wish you didn't have. So a problem behavior, and it could be something that you've done for a long time, so maybe you're a nail biter, or it could be some new behavior, maybe you just bought the new iPhone 4 and you're obsessed with the voice recognition feature. So think of some problem behavior that you have, and then imagine that you are walking, I'm not sure if the market here in Groningen has bookstores, but imagine you walk into a bookstore and you walk into the self-help section, and then you are browsing through the books and you come across these two options. And that plays out exactly the same regardless of whether people have chosen a behavior that for them is really habitual, so something they do very often, maybe have been doing for a long time and they always do it in the same environment, or whether it's something that's a new behavior, a new problem behavior for them. Okay? So it basically doesn't, this bias to go for the kind of motivationally oriented self-help book persists across both habitual and non-habitual behaviors. And then when in these studies, we probe a little bit deeper, people do recognize that their behavior is guided both by kind of these internal goal states and the external environment. So they recognize the influence of both sources of information, but they believe that their goals play the biggest role and that goals hold the kind of key to autonomy and self-change. Okay? So why is that interesting? Well, what I'm going to argue today partly is that people, especially when it comes to their habits, dramatically overestimate the influence that comes from their kind of internal goals and motivations. And that perhaps is not so controversial for this audience, but over and above that people also falsely believe that more goal-directedness necessarily equals more autonomy. Okay? So, and then the second question, I guess, is why would you care about this? This is, after all, asking average people what their kind of folk psychology is about themselves. And so why would people who study autonomy, the science of autonomy, and want to create systems that have autonomy, why would people's folk conceptions that may or may not be accurate, why would that matter? Well, what I want to suggest is that this is one area where science to some degree has kind of imitated folk psychology. Okay, so many of our theories postulate that humans are fundamentally goal-directed, okay, and that more goal-directedness necessarily equates to more autonomy. Certainly the early models that are influential in psychology and that came out of cybernetics, and I guess a part of your traditions as well, made that premise. And finally, our models often assume that people are achieving kind of real autonomy or quintessential autonomy when they kind of exert top-down control to free themselves up from environmental influence. That's perhaps the kind of quintessential experience of what it means to be autonomous. And what I'm going to try and do today is use empirical research on the phenomenon of habits, on this portion of our behavior, to challenge each one of those assumptions. Okay, so this is a sort of temporally, this is the way we'll move through the talk. First of all, I'm going to present to you the data suggesting that this portion of human behavior is triggered largely independently from the actor's goals and intentions, and instead is very heavily environmentally driven. And I know that that's not perhaps now a controversial premise in your field in psychology. It still is to some degree, and so I'll be kind of providing you with all of the empirical evidence for the way that this phenomenon works out. But then I'm going to make the point that the fact that our habits are not under the direct control of our goals is not necessarily a bad thing in terms of our capacity to be autonomous, because the majority of our habits are kind of blindly, if you like, in the service of our goals. Okay, because for one reason, they reflect the residue of past goal pursuit. They originate in goal pursuit. And then the sort of final and maybe most controversial thing will be that I'm going to present data to you suggesting that actually habits, this kind of bottom-up, environmentally cued form of automatic control, can sometimes be superior to active top-down self-control as a mechanism for helping actors attain their goals. And I'll try and present some new data from humans, experimental field studies, showing that phenomenon. Okay, so a good place to sort of start and situate this, though, is just to look a little bit at how transformative the act of behavior repetition is within the human cognitive system. Okay, and so firstly, just to give you kind of a little bit of context for this. So there are some interesting kind of ecological sampling studies that have been done, basically where people wear a beeper, and then at random intervals throughout the day, they're asked, what they're doing and what the environment is. And those studies give one way of kind of estimating how much of everyday life is habitual. Obviously, this is a continuum, so this is a slight simplification, but by this measure, about 45% of what people do, they do daily or almost daily and in exactly the same environment. So it has the two kind of behavioural ingredients that we think of as critical for habit formation, which is just high frequency of performance and performance in a stable context, in the same environment. Okay. And that kind of repetition leads to changes that are evident at the cognitive level. So as you know, we see a shift from declarative to more procedural memory. We see the chunking of what were initially discrete actions into sequences. And then we also see changes at the neural level, both structurally and functionally. So functional changes, for example, shifts in activation from when a behaviour is first being learned, from more frontal regions to the basal ganglia when it's been established as a habit. And even some very cool studies suggesting structural changes if you take a kind of liberal view of what a habit is. One of my favourite is Maguire's study looking at the hippocampi of London cab drivers. I don't know if you know this study, but he found that I think the right hippocampus of London cab drivers is larger than age-matched controls and is correlated with the size is correlated with the number of years they've been driving. Okay, so even perhaps structural changes as a result of habit formation. Okay, so repetition is powerful, and even though the outward behaviour of the organism might look exactly the same, the mechanisms generating it are very different. Okay, so that kind of leads me to this first idea of habits versus goal-directed control. And as I said, what I'm going to try and do is challenge this idea that people's goals and intentions, the sort of valued outcomes that are mentally represented, are always the kind of most proximate causes of behaviour. And still in psychology, a lot of our theories assume that. I know that in your field, a more nuanced view has already evolved. But there's now a fair amount of behavioural data, social science data, showing that that's not the case. I wanted to give you just a couple of examples of what I think are the most compelling forms of evidence for this. So one of them was a meta-analysis, so a sort of compilation of a whole bunch of studies published by Ouellette and Wood a little over 10 years ago. And basically what they did was collect a whole bunch of behaviour prediction studies. So these, and they all had this kind of general structure. So at time one, in fact, I'll put up this sort of schematic here. At time one, they measured basically how frequently a person had done something in the past. And they, across all of these studies, a very wide range of human behaviour was studied, everything from flu shots to seatbelt use to registering for classes. And then intentions to perform that behaviour in the future. So basically, if you just ask someone, how strongly do you intend to go and get a flu shot next year, for example. And then these are longitudinal studies, so then came back to people sometime later to get measures of whether or not they actually did perform that behaviour or not. Okay? And so that's the sort of general structure of all the studies that were in this meta-analysis. And then what they did was divide the studies into ones that examined behaviours that were performed infrequently or in variable environments. Okay, so these are the sort of non-habits, if you like. And then studies that examined behaviours that were performed very frequently and in the same environment. So something like exercise versus a flu shot. Okay, and so then the goal was to say, okay, what is the kind of predictive power of these two elements, past behaviour, meaning basically just the frequency in which you perform the behaviour in the past, versus your intention in predicting whether or not you do the behaviour in the future. And so what they found was that for the kind of non-habitual behaviours, intentions are a strong positive predictor of whether or not you engage in the behaviour in the future. But that effect disappears for behaviours that are performed very frequently and in the same environment. So basically, if you intend, the predictive value of your intention drops to nearly zero for behaviours that are performed very frequently in the same environment. Okay. A kind of similar pattern was revealed in a nice meta-analysis of behavioural intervention data. So very kind of structurally similar. The difference in this meta-analysis is that they looked at studies that instead of measuring people's intentions, went in and tried to change them. So typically these are like health intervention studies where you're trying to go into a population and convince young people to use condoms, for example, and then you measure the rates of safe sex following that. So what they did was collect a bunch of behavioural interventions, all of which had the goal of changing people's intentions, okay, and then looked at how successful they were in changing people's behaviour as a product of changing people's intentions. And they divided the studies into, as with the previous meta-analysis, into studies that targeted behaviours that are performed very infrequently and in varying contexts, okay, something like registering for a class, or behaviours that are performed frequently and in the same environment. So again, something like exercise. And then they estimated the effect size of the intervention on people's behaviour. So, and what they found was that for studies in which the intervention was changing behaviour, was changing non-habitual behaviour, there was a strong effect size. Okay, this is a Cohen's d, so that counts as a kind of strong effect size. But the effect of changing intentions for behaviours that are strongly habitual was very weak. Okay, so basically what this means is changing intentions works for behaviours that are not habitual. It doesn't work for behaviours that are habitual. So that's two kind of examples that I think set up this idea that as a behaviour becomes more routinized, more habitual, the control of people's intentions and goals recedes dramatically. Okay, so then the question becomes, of course, well, if not goals and intentions, then what? And I'm going to present to you two studies that come out of our lab that have addressed this question. One of them is a field experiment that kind of directly tried to pit people's motivational states and the environment as cues for behaviour to see how those two sources of information would influence behaviour as a function of how habitual the response was for a given participant. And then a lab experiment that tries to look more at the kind of cognitive representation of habits. Okay, so here's the field experiment we did. So what I want you to do is imagine that you've gone to a movie cinema, okay, and you have a little a carton of popcorn with you, and you start to eat. And if you're anything like me, all of the popcorn will be gone before you even get through the movie trailers. Okay, and you'll ask yourself, well, why on earth did I do this? This is such a strange thing. What is internally, what is going on driving that process? Is it that this is just so delicious that I'm compelled by this strong motivation, this strong intention to keep shoveling this into my face? Or is it instead that the environment is playing a strong role in cueing this behaviour? Okay? And does the relative influence of those two things vary as a function of whether you're a person who has a habit in that particular environment? Okay, so that was kind of what we were looking at in this experiment. So basically what we did was we recruited a couple of hundred people, and then they were randomly assigned to one of two environments. Okay, so half of the people were asked to watch 15 minutes of movie trailers in a cinema, like in the photograph I showed you. And the other 15, so in the control condition, were so the other people were asked to watch 15 minutes of music videos in a darkened room. Okay, so the two environments felt very similar. They're both kind of large, darkened rooms with a bunch of people in them. But in one case, you have all of the cues associated with being in a movie cinema. You're watching a movie, that's the environment you're in, and in the other, you're not. Okay, so that's our manipulation of context or environment. And then what we did was we gave people, as they were walking in, a box of popcorn. And for some people, it was just popped like an hour earlier, so it was delicious and warm, and as you would expect. For other people, we'd popped it a week earlier, and it had been sitting in my office, and it was horrible, really, really, really horrible. And then, of course, people didn't know that the study was about popcorn eating. They thought it was about personality preferences. Social psychologists love to lie to their participants. So we made up an unnecessarily deceptive story. And after people left, we said, oh, we need to take back, we have to clean up the theatre, we have to take back your box of popcorn and your bottle of water. We got them to rate the popcorn that they'd received, whether they liked it or not. And we measured the strength of their habit for eating popcorn at the movie cinema. So basically it was just a very simple scale of when I'm at the movie cinemas, I never to always eat popcorn. So basically this is just a measure of how frequently you've engaged in this behaviour in the past. And we assume that people who score highly are more likely to have some kind of habitual disposition to eat. Okay, so first just a little manipulation check. People rated rated the popcorn, and this scale went from extreme dislike to extreme like. That's the midpoint of the scale there. That's on the dotted line. So you can see the people in the fresh condition liked the popcorn, and people in the stale condition disliked it. Importantly, there were no effects of habit strength on that. So people who had strong habits to eat popcorn didn't like the popcorn any more or less than people who lacked habits, and also the environment had no influence on that. So people were equally apt to like the fresh and dislike the stale in both of the environments that we tested. Okay. But then of course the question is, well, what about people's behaviour? Okay, so first of all we're going to show you the control condition. So this is where people are watching music videos in a darkened room. Okay, so the environmental cues associated with a cinema are not in place. And what you can see here is the amount that's consumed by people who have strong or weak habits as a function of whether the food was fresh or stale. And basically all you can see here is a main effect of whether or not the food is fresh or stale. So people both with strong habits and weak habits eat it if it's fresh, and they don't eat it if it's stale. Okay, that difference there is not significant. Okay, so this is kind of rational behaviour. I'm not going to eat stale popcorn, and I'm going to eat it if it's nice. But what happens in the other environment? So what you can see here is that the people with weak habits still act rationally, right? They eat the popcorn if it's fresh, and they reject it if it's stale. But the people with strong habits eat exactly the same amount, exactly the same, regardless of whether it's fresh or stale. And keep in mind that they told us they didn't like it, right? So it's not that they like the popcorn. They just shovel it into their face, provided that they're in the environment that their mind associates with consuming popcorn. Okay, so that's the critical piece of this, right? That you only get this strange behaviour if the person is in the environment that they associate with prior performance of the behaviour. Okay, so this kind of supports in a more experimental way what those behaviour prediction studies are saying, that habit formation involves a binding of environment and behaviour such that goals have little influence, so long as you're in the environment that you have come to associate with performing the response. You'll note that the people with the popcorn consumption habits, when they were in a novel environment, ate less stale than fresh popcorn, right? So provided you're in the environment that you associate with the habit, it will tend to run out to completion regardless of whether it's delivering a good or a bad outcome. Okay? So the next question that I want to sort of address is, well, what does this process look like at a more cognitive representational level? One way to think about this is if a person has a tendency to engage in a particular behavior in a particular environment, so they always run along the beach, or maybe you always, here in Groningen, you ride your bicycle to the university, what kind of implicit cognitive association, if any, forms between the behavior and the environment? Okay? Basically in this study, we tried to get at that question by looking at exercise behavior. So we got a bunch of people, some of whom run a lot and some of whom don't run at all. Okay, so we had the kind of full breadth of the habit strength continuum, if you like. And we got them to just tell us, where do you run? Okay, come up with a single word or two words to describe the environment in which you run. So it might be, I always run at the gym on the treadmill, or we did this study at Duke, and Duke, is surrounded by forests, and so a lot of people run through the forest. And then we say, well, why do you run? What's the goal? What's the motivation that drives you to do it? And people would say things like, well, I do it for stress relief, or I do it to control my weight. Okay, so come up with a single word to describe the context and the goal that you believe motivates the behavior. Okay, and then what we did was we designed a kind of idiosyncratic lexical decision task for all of the participants that use the words that are kind of personally relevant for them. So so do you guys know basically what this test involves? I'll explain it briefly. So it's basically just a cognitive test that works on reaction times and is based on the principle of kind of spreading activation in a semantic network, right? So an example would be that if I subliminally prime you with the word doctor, and then immediately after that flash up a word and say, is this a real word or not? And the word was nurse, you'd make that recognition faster by virtue of having been primed with the word doctor, okay, because of spreading activation through the semantic network, right? Those dynamics are known to change based on people's idiosyncratic experiences through the world, right? So if you, for example, have engaged in a particular behavior a lot, then you at an individual level will show a stronger binding between two relevant concepts. Okay? So we were kind of leveraging that principle in this test here. So let me show you how this procedure works. So basically, a participant, I'm going to show you as a single trial, but we use hundreds of trials in these tests. So the participant's working on a computer, and first of all they see a masking stimulus for 100 milliseconds, and then a prime, and this is the stimulus that's designed to facilitate how a person reacts to what we present subsequently. Okay? So say you're a person who runs through the forest every day, right? So you're sitting in front of the computer, this thing pops up, and then this thing comes up so fast that you can't see it, 33 milliseconds, so you have no conscious experience of having seen it. And then it's immediately followed by another mask, which removes this from visual iconic memory, guarantees that you have no conscious experience of having seen it. And then after a variable delay, we present the word running, and your task is just to say, is this a word or not? Because across all of the trials, some of the words are real, like the word running, and some of them are nonsense words. So all you're doing is saying word, non-word, word, non-word, word, non-word. Okay? Okay, so, and the basic principle is we can measure how strongly this concept is bound to this concept by calculating how much more quickly you react to this by having been first primed with this. Okay. And we can, using that general technique in an experiment, we can measure a whole bunch of different kind of mental, idiosyncratic mental, implicit mental associations. So we can measure the link between the environment and the behavior, the goals and the behavior, the context and the goals, the behavior and the goal. We can measure whatever we want. So it's a very powerful and interesting kind of technique. Okay, so here's the data, right? So here on the x-axis, you'll basically see, so this is a continuum running from the people who don't have a strong habit to go running, to over on the right here, the people who have a strong habit, so people who run very frequently in the same environment. And what you'll see here is, so this is a facilitation score, so basically a higher score here means that a person is reacting more quickly relative to control trials, right, are reacting more quickly to that particular category of trials. So basically what this shows you is that the people with strong habits have this implicit mental association between the environment and the behavior. Okay? And the stronger the habit is, the stronger that implicit mental linkage between environment and behavior gets. But this is the slope for the goal associations. So what you can see here is that even the people who are strongly habitual runners don't show any mental binding between the behavior and the goal. Okay? So this sort of tracks the behavior prediction data and the popcorn data, basically suggests that the more frequently you do something in the same environment, the more it becomes mentally bound to the context and the less the goal is represented in the behavior mentally. Okay, so just to give a kind of little summary of this first theme. So, I think what this suggests is that we overestimate probably the extent to which our daily life is really under the active control of our goals. And that's certainly true for habits, right? So the people who are choosing the self-help book that targets their goals and motivations, especially if the behavior is highly habitual, are really making a poor choice. They should instead be targeting the environment. Okay? And we saw this across this sort of general principle across a bunch of different data sets. So intentions don't predict future habitual behavior or very weakly. Changing people's goals and intentions doesn't seem to budge their habits. It will change their intentions but not their behavior. And instead we saw that environmental cues can trigger habit performance, and even when the outcomes are pretty bad for people. And finally we saw that this is at the sort of cognitive representational level, this is evident in a kind of implicit mental binding of context and behavior, but not any binding of behavior and goals. Okay, so that's the sort of end of the first theme. I want to kind of pivot now to my admittedly amateurish analysis of whether this is good or bad news for autonomy. Okay. I want to suggest that I don't think this is necessarily bad news for autonomy, and for two reasons. One of them is very simple, and one of them is a bit more complex. So we'll start with the simple one first. The simple reason is that even though our habits may be not under the active control of our goals, they're typically consistent with them. Okay? And what I mean by that is many of our habits originate in goal pursuit that then becomes performed sufficiently to the point that it becomes autonomous from those goals. I can use autonomous in that confusing way here. And we can see this across a bunch of different data sets. So in some meta-analyses that have looked basically at the correlation between habit strength and goal strength, so basically how strongly do you hold a particular goal, generally find a strong positive correlation between the two. So what does that mean? Basically that the majority of our habits are consistent with our goals rather than running counter to them. Okay? So people have both bad and good habits, but the majority of our habits are good, and that's an important point. And this is also evident in some studies that have just asked people, list the behaviours you're trying to change at the moment. And in those studies, strong habits emerge as a surprisingly small percentage, about 25%. People are much more likely to mention things like temptations and addictions that are still perhaps automatic in some way, but are not habits. Okay? So the basic point being that this system, this bottom-up system, is maybe blind to our current goals, but it typically produces outcomes that are consistent with our goals. So that's the first kind of optimistic point. The second idea is a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to present you some data to try and support this argument. And I want to make the argument that we typically assume that autonomy is kind of epitomized through a very active top-down self-control process. Okay? But I want to question whether or not that kind of control always necessarily yields the best outcomes for people. Okay? And finally, I'm going to present some data to you to suggest that sometimes our habits outperform this kind of top-down self-control in delivering the outcomes people want. And then you can decide whether or not you think that constitutes an aid to autonomy. Okay, so to make sense of this, though, I need to take a little historical step back just for a moment and think about how we have conceptualized self-control. And obviously this is an idea that has a very long tradition. Okay, so going back to the Greeks or original sin, you could think of that as the sort of, an early case of self-control failure for which we apparently have been paying a heavy price ever since, if you're religious. Even William James had this idea that self-control is really, characterized, the quintessential self-control failure is impulses that discharge so promptly into movements that inhibitions get no time to arise. Okay? So the common denominator here is thinking of self-control as some sort of invigilating system that sanctions unwanted bad automatic impulses that are percolating up from somewhere else, right? That's the idea. So this kind of notion of self-control, right? But as the field has progressed, it's become evident that really the story is a little bit more complicated than that, okay? That yes, self-control is about inhibiting undesired lower impulses. It is about that, and that may be the majority of it even. But there's a lot else that falls under these two categories, okay? So we now know that this sort of same system, executive self-control system, is required for making many choices as opposed to few choices, initiating new actions, fixing attention. And we also know that there are other things over on this kind of the automatic impulse side of the ledger, right? In addition to undesired impulses, there's urges, and urges can be desirable or undesirable. There's heuristic decision making. There's even data on authentic self-presentation, okay? So now if you take seriously the idea that these are like two competing systems where the sort of activity level, especially on the left-hand side, will determine how much of this stuff gets access to behavior, right? Once you've expanded out of this layer here, it becomes evident that it's not always going to be the case that having more of your behavior controlled by this system and less by this system will always yield better outcomes, right? You can imagine scenarios where it might be better to go with a heuristic decision-making strategy than to think too deliberatively, okay? You can imagine situations where not having the executive self-control to override your authentic self-presentation could be an advantage. And in fact, there's a wonderful paper that was just published this year showing that very effect in interracial interactions. And basically what they did was put white and black college students together, and they suppressed the sort of executive self-control capacities of the white participants, right, by giving them some very taxing task. And then they made them interact with the black other student. And those interactions were rated as much smoother, much more enjoyable. And the argument was that all of these kind of uptight white college students who were kind of over-regulating their behavior when they've got enough self-control resources, they couldn't do that, and so they just had a much more authentic interaction with this other race participant. So you can imagine many situations where having more on this side of the ledger is not necessarily a good thing. And that's a kind of key premise for the rest of this talk. Okay, is more self-control always a good thing? Okay, so now let's pivot to habits, right? So habits obviously belong over here on the sort of automatic side of the ledger. And it's clearly the case that, having less self-control, so having less over on this side of the ledger, is going to open the floodgates for bad habits, right? That's, if you don't have executive self-control resources, you don't have the capacity to stop yourself from engaging in bad habits. Nothing controversial or interesting about that. But what we've been looking at is the idea that the same thing, the same phenomenon might occur for good habits, and for the very same reason, right? That deviating from good behaviors that are habitual involves a whole bunch of things that fit over here on the self-control side. So making many choices, initiating a new action, deviating from something you've done in the past, and fixing attention, okay? They're all things that you would have to engage in order to override a good habit. So that leads to a sort of, if you buy that logic, it leads to a kind of counterintuitive hypothesis that we've been exploring, and that is that when people lack self-control, they're going to fail at stopping bad habits, but they may also perform more good habits, right? Because their capacity to decide, to choose, to initiate new actions outside of their good habits has been diminished. So they kind of get locked into both the bad and the good. Does that make sense? Okay, and then keep in mind that, as I showed before, more of our habits are good than bad. So that leads to the sort of really radical idea that having less self-control, if it locks you into your habits and you have more good habits than bad habits, then the net effect of lowering self-control might actually be beneficial. Okay, so we've we've done 4 studies on this. I can move through them fairly fast. The first 3 are on state self-control. So basically, you can think about self-control both as like a trait, a sort of dispositional attribute that a person maybe is born with, or that's at least very stable over time. And you can also think about it as something that changes from moment to moment, right? So like many other psychological variables, it has both a sort of state version and a trait version. And we've looked at both in these studies. The first 3 studies are state, okay? And I'm going to tell you about a sort of field experiment where we looked at people's good and bad habits under depletion of self-control. And then another similar study we did with MBA students, and then a more kind of decision-making study. And then finally, this will be the final study I present, one looking at trait levels of self-control, so kind of dispositional self-control. Okay. So the first study that we did on this was a field experiment, and basically, as I said, our goal was to look at to try and manipulate people's level of self-control in the real world, and then look at what effect that had on their ability to carry out behaviours they were trying to perform and behaviours they were trying to stop themselves from performing as a function of how habitual those responses were. Okay, so at time 1, we had people come into the lab and just nominate 12 behaviours they were currently attempting to regulate. Okay, so 6 of them were things they were trying to do, and 6 of them were things they were trying not to do. Okay, so this might be, for example, I'm trying to go to the gym every day this week, or I'm trying not to watch television after dinner and instead get on with my homework. Okay, so behaviours that you're both trying to perform and not perform. Okay, and then this is actually the sort of the field experiment piece of the study. Over 4 days, we had people tell us in through little diaries whether or not they performed each one of those 12 behaviours that day, just a simple dichotomous yes or no. And then on 2 of the 4 days of the study, we depleted people's self-control resources. Okay, and this is a technique that's been developed in social psychology. Basically what we do is we got people to use their non-dominant hand for a whole range of tasks throughout the day. Okay, and you can imagine how taxing this is. You're constantly overriding the need to pick up your cell phone with your right hand if you're right-handed, or open doors, or use a computer mouse. And so it's very annoying, and it's been shown as a technique to reduce people's kind of top-down self-control resources. You're kind of imposing a chronic load on that system throughout the day. And so what we wanted to see was, how is people's behaviour different on the 2 days when they're under this load? Okay. And then at time 3, we had people come back into the lab. This is at the end of the study, and they rated the behaviours, the 12 behaviours, on how frequently and how context stable they'd been for the 6 months prior to the study. So that's how we worked out what was a habit and what wasn't a habit. Okay, so here's the data. So first of all, let's look at undesirable behaviours. So these are the things that people were saying, okay, over the next 4 days, I really want to not do these things. Okay, so what I'm going to show you, this is the results of a logistic regression. Basically, it's just the likelihood of stopping yourself from performing the behaviour. So a higher score here means that you manage to stop yourself from performing these actions, like eating junk food, watching TV. So first of all, you can see that, so these are bad behaviors that were weak habits, okay? No effect of depletion, okay? So no effect of whether you were having to do the strange thing with your non-dominant hand or not, right? So it's not surprising. And as you can see, as the bad behavior becomes more habitual, it becomes more affected by the depletion manipulation. So for bad behaviors that are strong habits, people had a really hard time stopping themselves from performing them when they were depleted. That's not surprising, right? No self-control, can't stop myself from performing bad behaviors. The interesting thing is over on the right-hand side. So what happens with desirable behaviors? So keep in mind here that this scale here is likelihood of successful regulation. So over here, a higher score means a person managed to make themselves perform the behavior that they wanted to perform, okay? So you kind of want the line to be going up. That means good self-regulation. Okay, so again, these are behaviors of low habit strength. Okay, that line is actually, statistically, it's a flat line. So again, no effect of the hand manipulation on people's ability to carry out these weak, good habits. No effect for moderate habits. But this is the interesting thing, right? So this is the hypothesized effect that people with no self-control were more likely to perform their good habits than people who had like a full resource available to them. Okay? So that really sets up the idea that yes, self-control, having no self-control means you can't inhibit your bad habits, but it also means you're going to be locked into performing your good habits, and you'll be even more likely to carry through with them. Okay.
Sorry,
yeah.
It is good habits. I understood that it's some kind of desirable behavior, which is not a habit. It is again habit.
It's a what?
The good habits is again a habit. That means you have done it repeatedly.
Well, yes. So we have. So basically, what we do is it's defined by. So the good-bad distinction is defined by the participant themselves, right? So they're saying these are things I want not to do, and these are things I want to do, and then the habit strength is defined by how frequently they've done the behavior in the past and whether they do it in the same environment when they do it. And then so actually what this is statistically plotting the slopes for people who are at the mean level of habit strength, that's that line there, and then who are one standard deviation above the mean and one standard deviation below the mean. Yeah. Okay. So then what we did was we wanted to kind of replicate, because that's a sort of strange effect to think that low self-control would mean you actually do better at implementing these good habits. And so we replicated the study with MBA students and focused specifically on a bunch of kind of morning behaviours, okay? So the food choices they make, what they drink, and what newspapers they read, because these made up our dependent variables. Okay, so basically, again, we had a bunch of good and a bunch of bad behaviours. So in food choices, you know, we defined a good choice as, well, I'm going to eat cold cereal or hot cereal, and a bad choice would be a pastry, or I can't even read that, pancakes. Okay, and then basically all of the coffee choices were bad. These are MBA students. What is it, America? And then newspaper choices. So these are MBA students, so they're supposed to be reading the sort of highbrow parts of the newspaper, and this is advice columns down here. Okay, so and in the start, so we sort of tracked their performance of these behaviours across essentially a whole semester, right? And then we could work out we defined whether or not a given behaviour was a habitual choice for a given participant by whether they defined it themselves as a routine, and then whether or not they performed it in the first 2 weeks of the study. So it was a kind of, our measure of habit in this study was a combination of self-report and getting their baseline, how frequently they performed the behaviour in the first 2 weeks of the semester. Okay? Okay. So those are the behaviours we're tracking. Then the question is, what happens to the kind of ecology of people's behaviour across the weeks in which they lack self-control versus the weeks in which they have more self-control. Okay, so we used exam weeks as our depletion of self-control resources, and that's been used in several prior studies. So we know that during exam week, people really lack self-control because they're devoting whatever self-control they have to prepping for their exams. And so what we are predicting, in line with the previous study, is that we get an upsurge in both good and bad habits during those exam weeks. Okay, and that's indeed what we found here. So basically what this is showing you is the presence of that predicted interaction, so an interaction between habit strength and whether or not you're under an exam for each of those behaviours. And you can see, I think we get it for 9 out of 12 of the behaviours, this crossover effect where people are performing more of both the good and the bad when their self-control has been taxed by exams. And so again, it's kind of counterintuitive to think that these MBA students are more likely to be doing things like reading the news in the editorial page despite having no self-control, if that's a habit for them. Okay. And then the final study in this little sequence, we tried to look at this in a sort of more decision-making context. Okay. So we got people in this study to make choices about different snacks, okay, some of which were good and some of which were bad, and we did this in a class that was about to have an exam. Okay, so we laid out 2 tables, and one of them had a bunch of bad options on it. So things like mini little chocolate bars and sugar cookies and popcorn. You can see we have we should really try and get sponsorship by some popcorn manufacturer, shouldn't we? And then we had a table with a bunch of good options, so protein snacks, low-fat wheat crackers, that kind of thing, right? And then we asked people to choose the option you would most prefer to consume right now. And people made one bad choice and one good choice. Okay, and here's the manipulation, the self-control manipulation. We got people to make the choice either just before or just after the exam. Okay, the assumption being that just before the exam, people haven't gone through the experience yet, they'd have relatively higher self-control, and just after it, they'd have relatively low self-control. Okay, and then we collected a bunch of other measures that are not so important, but just for ruling out alternative explanations if you're interested. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is the likelihood of choosing an option that reflected your habitual choice as a function of whether you were choosing before the exam or after the exam. And basically what this shows you here is that people who were making the choice post-exam, so who lacked self-control, were significantly more likely to choose an option that was higher in habit strength for them, right? So that's what that slope there means, that the people choosing after the exam are choosing an option that's a more habitual option. And the critical thing is there was no interaction with whether or not that was a good choice. They were choosing a good item or a bad item, right? So again, what this phenomenon is showing is a drift towards the habitual when people lack self-control. And that drift is occurring both for undesirable bad behaviours, but also for desirable good behaviours. Okay, so that is that's state self-control. In our recent work, we have tried to kind of expand this to look at dispositional self-control. Okay, so as I said, self-control also varies kind of at the personality level, and there are now decent survey measures where you can give people 20 questions and you can work out, are they a person who has high self-control or low self-control? So that's what we were using in these studies. And so the general question is, are people who have chronically low trait self-control, do they live more habitual lives? And does that work for them? Does it produce good outcomes? Okay, so we did this actually in 2 studies, but they're basically identical, so I'm going to present them together. One of them was, the study on the left was a study about basically how people prepare for exams, and the one on the right is about how people exercise. Okay? They're structurally identical, it's just that the content around those 2 issues differs. So basically, very simple, they're both survey studies. So participants in the study get the measure of trait self-control. So they fill out a questionnaire essentially measuring their trait level of self-control. And then we just ask them, how many different behaviours do you rely on to prepare for exams or exercise? Okay? And then we measured how habitual those options are that they use. Okay? So just so you can kind of get a feel for what this looked like. So this is the questionnaire from the exam study. So the students are basically asked to say, what percentage of your total exam preparation time do you devote to each one of these strategies? So a person might fill it out like this. So that person would have used 3 means. Okay? Or a person might have put 20% in each one of them, in which case they would have used 5 means. And then we ask them, how frequently do you perform the behaviour, and when you perform it, is it in the same context? And that's our normal measure of habit strength. We multiply those two together. Okay, so let's look at what people who have chronically low self-control, what they look like in terms of the number of behaviours they rely on to achieve their goals. Okay, so first of all, you'll see the exam preparation study. So what you can see is the people who have low self-control rely on significantly fewer means than the people who have high self-control. The same thing over here for exercise. Okay. And those behaviours that they rely on are higher in habit strength. And you see that again for both studies. So lacking self-control, lacking this sort of top-down executive resource, these people put more of their kind of eggs in fewer baskets. That's a terrible metaphor. They rely on fewer behaviours to achieve their goals, okay? And those behaviours that they rely on are more habitual. Did you have a question?
So what does this self-report scale, what is it like, what does it measure exactly?
It's a good question. So it has like 22 items in it, and they're things like, I am generally good at resisting temptation. I plan ahead effectively. I don't leave things to the last minute. Yeah.
So it's not exactly the same things as you're trying to measure?
No, it's actually very. That's a good question. Yeah, but they're very similar. Yeah, I mean they're not similar. My jet lag is really hitting me at this. But that's a good question. Okay, so lacking self-control, they use fewer means, and those means are more habitual. And then the final piece of data I want to present to you is, well, does this work for them? Okay, is this, in some sense, a really adaptive and beneficial strategy? And then we can speculate about whether or not that means this system is aiding these people's autonomy in the absence of high levels of self-control. So we've tested this just in one way. In one of those studies, the one where we looked at exercise behaviours, we also measured people's body mass index. Okay, so basically, as you know, this is a scale that's based on height and weight and gender, and I think a BMI of over like 23 point something, maybe 24, it puts you in the overweight category. And so what I'm going to show you here is the BMI of our participants as a function of their trait level of self-control and how many means they use to pursue their exercise goals. And so what you can see here is that the people who have low trait self-control have a lower BMI, which is obviously a good thing. They have a lower BMI when they rely on few means. Whereas the reverse is true for people who have high self-control. Okay? They do better, they have lower BMI when they use many means. So what does this suggest? It suggests that people are experiencing different outcomes. They're experiencing better or worse outcomes based on their level of self-control and whether they choose to invest in just a small set of behaviours to achieve their goals or to diversify and rely on a bunch of different behaviours. If you lack self-control, the optimal strategy is to invest in a small set of habits and so maintain your BMI. If you have ample self-control, the optimal strategy is to diversify, employ many different behaviours of varying habit strength. Okay? So, to kind of sum all of this up, what I want to suggest is that these data really show that significantly less of our behavior than we might like to think is probably goal-directed, okay? But that's not necessarily bad news for autonomy, depending on how liberal a definition of autonomy you wish to use, okay? And that's because our habits, although they are bottom-up, environmentally driven, the majority of them deliver outcomes that are consistent with our goals, okay? We have many more good than bad habits. And moreover, as we saw in the kind of final set of studies, active self-control is not all it's cracked up to be, okay? For one thing, it's finite and it can be depleted, right? So habits serve a function in that they conserve that resource so we can invest it selectively where we need to. But more importantly, we saw that self-control, although it's good for inhibiting bad habits, also appears to undermine good habits as well, okay? So it's not necessarily the case that we do better at regulating our behavior when we have high levels of self-control. The reverse is actually true if you look at people's habits. And then finally, I think what the data show are that habits really do provide us with a mechanism to thrive and experience positive regulatory outcomes, okay, which you can define as a criterion for autonomy when we lack active self-control. And I think that challenges strongly the idea that autonomy should be linked in a one-to-one way with this kind of active top-down self-control resource. I think this data shows that a more nuanced perspective is needed. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention and happily take questions. I like this cartoon. I'll put that up there as a background.
So whether or not you're in the habit of asking questions, the chances of people not being in the habit of asking questions are low.
Could you show those two book covers again?
Mm-hmm.
Back to the beginning again, because my question has to do with the extent to which your narrative fits the data.
Okay. That's bad.
So I'm just looking for the exact word. There we go, the two, right?
Yeah.
So neutralizing the environment. So is it possible to interpret that total as the choice to neutralize the environment? Exercise self-control in controlling the environment as a way of walking back. So
It is, although that's not necessarily inconsistent. I mean, our premise is not that, obviously the agent would have to act on the environment, right, in order to affect change. It's basically, if a person is choosing, okay, I'm going to act in some way to improve my behavior, I can act to change my goals and motivations, or I can act to manipulate the environment. Which do they choose to do? And so we find that they choose to focus on their goals and motivations, where in actual fact it would be wiser, if the behavior is a habit, to focus on altering the environment in some way.
But you don't see those as being mutually exclusive, do you? I mean, the choice to neutralize the environment and the choice to exercise top-down kind of control.
We don't see those as mutually exclusive?
No, you
No.
don't. Do you?
No.
No, but,
Do
okay,
you think of them as mutually exclusive?
Well, I mean, your conclusions seem to point to this dichotomy between high-level control and environmental
Right.
factors, and the narrative really stresses that your research is showing these two mechanisms are very, very different. And my point is that, I think you might have to nuance this kind of distinction, and that actually there's high-level control in choosing to neutralize the environment.
That is true. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we focus very much on, obviously the two systems, if you take seriously the idea that these are two systems and they're each yielding different kinds of outputs, right? And so we focus on what is the output of the habit system, and it really does seem to be a context-cued component. I mean, you saw that in the popcorn study, the amount that was eaten, there was absolutely no effect whatsoever of the freshness and staleness manipulation, right? So it's not even as if in that data, people are kind of integrating two different sources of information, the value of the food plus what the environment is telling them. There was literally no impact of the value of the food in that study. So those sort of data suggest that you can get real-world situations where it is a very categorical, this system or that system is controlling the behavior.
Yeah, I would like to ask you for a definition or explanation of the notion of habit.
Mm-hmm.
I take it that it's something more complex than a reflex
Mm-hmm.
that can be also elicited,
Yeah.
but may be different from other environmentally cued behaviors like the ones revealed by Barks' research on social imitation, from
Yep.
implicit or unconscious,
Yep.
or even the notion of affordance, in which
Yep.
I mean, just the
Yep.
configuration in the environment elicits.
Yep.
In particular, I would like to see how representational you think a habit is, given that you have given this evidence of semantic priming
Mm-hmm.
of concepts associated to the habits. Well, I would tend to think that habit is a sort of sensory motor schema.
Yep. Yep, great question. So we have, there's multiple different levels on which you can operationalize the construct, right? So, you could, and you show your disciplinary allegiances in which one you choose. So we've tried to be very inclusive. So perhaps the holy grail obviously is to do it in terms of neural systems, right? So there should be an engagement of the basal ganglia, right, as opposed to systems involved with declarative memory, like the medial temporal lobe. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it, often in our experiments we do it behaviorally though, by just using the frequency and the context stability as a kind of proxy for habit strength. What else do we do? In some other studies, we've done it by using experiments that are designed specifically to tap into procedural versus declarative memory. So experimentally, right? We've done it that way. So really, yeah, we define it in terms of those that context response linkages that are formed through high frequency, context stable repetition in the past. There's another way of doing it, which is to rely on the animal learning literature. We do that in the popcorn study, and that is basically to show that to define a habit in terms of the absence of an effect of a goal value shift, right? So that study was matched very closely on old reinforcer devaluation studies they do with rats, right, where they train a rat to perform a behavior like press a bar to get some food, and then after they've done it 200 or 300 times, they switch the food so that it tastes toxic, and yet the rat will continue to perform the behavior. So that's so you can define habits behaviorally in that sense by showing that they persist despite a shift in the value of the outcome. So that's not a great answer, but it's basically that every different sub-discipline has a different way of defining it and operationalizing it, and we've tried to use one that is kind of consistent with all of them, and we draw from all of them.
Thank you for a very clear and fascinating talk. We've looked at habit in the context of perseveration, piagestion, A not B kind of situations, right, in which we were, in our modeling, we were sort of proud to discover what the habit is good for there. We were able to show, for instance, in a robot demonstration that having the habit enables the system to succeed in a goal-oriented behavior under more difficult sensory motor conditions. It's much more low level, of course, and very simple skill. But I wonder about the main narrative in that field about the role of habit, which seems to be a little bit in conflict with what you're saying, and that people usually think of the habitual response being the bad one that doesn't follow the cue, where you don't do the new task. And in our theorizing, it was related to a lack of flexibility. That is, when the goal changes, you're not so quick in finding a solution to that. And could you comment on that? And from your perspective, is there another dimension there of a difference between this goal-oriented strategy and the habitual one?
Yeah, I can't see how those are inconsistent. I mean, you can definitely think of the failure to shift your behavior in response to whether the food is fresh or stale as an absence of flexibility, right? So provided the environmental cues are there to guide the behavior, you don't show flexibility in a way that meets a goal you have, which is to eat food only if it's fresh and palatable. So I don't see, are you suggesting that this is inconsistent with the lack of flexibility idea?
I see that it's empirically consistent.
Yeah.
I thought your message was that one can achieve a lot with
Right.
good habits.
And
But I
yes.
wonder maybe a limitation
Yes.
is that might be less flexible overall.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Yeah, I understand you now. Yeah, I mean, that's the great... You see this distinction in a couple of other, conceptualizations as well, like that this is an inexpensive system in the sense of, right, it doesn't require many resources to function, but it's kind of ballistic. And so it works very well if the output is going to be consistent with people's goals. But the minute, as you say, that the system needs flexibility, then you need the much more computationally expensive top-down kind of control to be engaged. So this is great where what you've done, I think the supposed way to sum it up is that this is a great system where what you need to do in the future is what you did in the past. And so long as that's the case, then these are highly adaptive and could be viewed as promoting autonomy. But as soon as that calculus changes, they become a liability.
Great, thanks for calling me just then, because I almost asked a question in a
Right.
way. So I really liked your talk, and I really liked at the end when you really were showing the trade-off, so that it was actually sort of a cost to be to have good self-control, because it seemed then you needed to have more behaviors in order to get the
Yep,
good BMI.
that's right.
But then the question is when you well, as you said, it's a cost benefit. And to be fair, if the world has changed and habits aren't useful, the context has changed too. So
Yes.
presumably you aren't getting thrown into them.
Yep.
So I was wondering, are there other correlates with the self-control method? I just don't know the literature. I'm aware of it, but I don't know it. Does IQ is a strategy too? It's a continuum. Conservatism, political conservatism. Are any of these things correlated with these kind of things?
There's one paper, I mean this measure came out a couple of years ago. There's one paper that looked at IQ and self-control and a couple of other things in predicting academic performance. And basically this self-control outperforms IQ in predicting academic success.
So they can't be perfectly correlated.
Pardon?
So they can't be perfectly
No, they're right, exactly. But I can't remember what, the extent to which they were correlated. I don't think very highly.
Both of them as being explored versus exploited
Yeah.
strategies,
Right.
At the genomic
Yep.
level.
Yep.
Yes, you actually showed us that self-control could be adaptive, could be good in some cases. But in my opinion, in order to make this conclusion, we have to address the second question, and this is what is the role of self-control in acquiring bad and good habits?
Yeah.
So, have you addressed
So
it?
do you? No, that's a good point. So the extent to which, well, you don't. I don't think you do need self-control for acquiring habits in the first place. People can use self-control in order to. I think self-control plays a bigger role in unlearning habits than in learning them in the first place, because the habit learning systems are engaged whether or not people are intending to use them or not, right? So you don't need to set a conscious, intentional goal to acquire a habit in order to acquire one. And in fact, there is some data suggesting that it may be easier to acquire habits to the extent that you lack executive control resources. So there's one paper that was published last year showing that people pick up habits more rapidly if they have low working memory. It's not exactly the same as self-control, but they're both kind of executive control resources. So I think your question's a good one. I think the need for self-control comes in more in the habit breaking component than the habit forming component.
But please, some of your examples, for example, going to the gym every day,
Yep.
even if this is a habit, at least in the beginning, it's
Yes.
a matter of self-control.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So in order to set up the behavioural trajectory, often you need self. That's right. Yeah, yeah, I agree with that.
So you pit habit and self-control against each other.
Yeah.
And then of course the question is, where's autonomy? But if you replace habit by skill, then of course you can say skill makes good habits. But then control becomes much more an extension of skill, because where your skills run out, you need control to figure out maybe the rest of the search space, as the first speaker. And then maybe you get a better handle on the idea of autonomy, that good autonomy is knowing where your skills run out and then switch to control. How would you consider such
a formulation?
Breaking the dichotomy and seeing how they extend each other?
I think I understand that. I mean, it does make me think though of, it makes me think of the choking literature in sports, right? Where you do have a scenario where, as you know, the basic phenomenon in that literature is the more skilled a person is, the more likely they are to be undermined in performing the behaviour if their motivation is high, right? Because they will, like a skilled putter, for example, like a golfer, will be more likely to mess up if they're given a really high incentive, because they falsely believe that by switching to more controlled processing, they'll execute the behaviour more accurately. So I think I agree with you that part of the challenge is understanding when this habitual system is going to deliver good outcomes and when it's not. I'm skeptical that people are very good at that, because I think the choking literature suggests that people don't have very good insight into when they should rely on this bottom-up processing versus top-down processing, and we have a bias to think that if only I can if I can think my way through this, I'll do a better job.
But isn't that biasing it to the cases where it goes wrong, while in most
Yeah,
cases
maybe.
it will work out well?
I don't know. You think in most cases? Yeah. In some cases, definitely. Yeah.
That was a great talk, and I'm going to be very careful about how my popcorn tastes in the future. What I'm interested in is how you think the results carry over to those who are making the robots.
I was hoping that you could answer that question, or someone else could answer that question. I don't. Well, that's a good question, and I'll remind me to punch you later on for asking it. I think that one thing this data does is, it shows how human beings do function, on these issues. So I'm very interested in the question of whether or not you need systems that emulate people, and so are these data valuable in that sense, in that they give a window into how people really do self-regulate with low self-control. But so when I was coming here, that's the question that I was hoping the answer would be yes, that by providing more descriptive data about how human beings actually function on some of these issues, and how autonomy might be injected or might be expressed through some of these alternate mechanisms that operate outside of active top-down control, that it might be valuable to hear about that. But honestly, that's my, I don't know enough about your field. I hope that the answer to that is yes, but I would need to hear from you to know.
It certainly has produced more hands.
Yeah.
Questions?
Looking at this from another angle, I'm starting off by asking you how your work fits in with a wider view of neural systems and so on. Because would it be fair to say that habit forming is a sensitivity to frequencies of various behaviours? And it does seem that there's very primitive mechanisms that in humans that are sensitive to statistical distributions. For example, in my work, which is, this is how it relates to robotics, which is how robots might learn language. We start by setting some parameters, and we take analogies with human characteristics. And one of them is the sensitivity to distribution of phonemes in tiny children. So you've got this observed empirical fact that very small infants are sensitive to statistical distributions. Now, would you say that what you're looking at with these habits is another facet of the sensitivity to statistical distributions?
Yes, and I think that it essentially has to be like the way we think about it is like more like the covariation detection literature, that it's that this form of learning is relying on people's capacity to engage in implicit covariation detection, right? So take something like the popcorn study. No one has walked into that environment and said, okay, I have a goal now to learn to associate this environment with this behavior and sort of outsource control of the behavior to the environment. No one has done that, except the data suggests that people have probably through covariation detection mechanisms have forged some mental link between the environment and the behavior by picking up, as you say, the co-occurrence of the two, and that over time has acquired some power to energize people's behavior and trigger the response or keep it going once they're in that environment and the cues are present. So I see it very much as specifically consistent with that implicit, unintended, a sort of Lewicki, implicit covariation detection kind of literature.
Yes, because we make explicit assumptions and we can justify an assumption by saying it's analogous to what you find in a human, but we accept all along that it is an assumption. And then we set parameters within which our system or our robot is going to operate, using the word autonomy in a slightly different way to the way it's used in the outside world.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's coming back to the question that you asked, how does all this apply to robots, okay? Which is a good question. And perhaps putting up a point that also for Joanna and for you is, we all have in the horizon of our research robots autonomy, or more or less, okay, distant or not. But when we try to understand what autonomy is, we look at what is available in terms of observable for autonomy. You have animals, you have humans, okay? For animals, well, we know what life is, even if we're not able to define very precisely, not able to build it up in labs yet, but we understand what life is, okay? So we can speak about animal autonomy, saying intelligent things, quite well mastered. But if you go to human autonomy, my God, hey, when you address human autonomy, you address self-consciousness, free will, we're totally ignorant of the nature of self-consciousness and of free will. So I have the feeling that if we keep on the horizon of research, bring autonomy to artifacts and robots, we should focus much more on the easiest point, the one to address first, which is animal autonomy. And then, but then after, use this understanding to go to human autonomy, assuming we'll have to address self-consciousness and free will and so on. So it's a kind of overall question for Jonah perhaps also. I understand all the research made by psychologists on human autonomy, but I think they're kind of in the middle of nowhere if we're not clear enough on animal autonomy. Don't you think so?
That could be true. I mean, I honestly don't, because you're asking the question from your discipline. So I guess that assumes that it's sort of scalable, that what you then model in the animal system will provide a sort of incremental stepping stone to modeling human autonomy, which may or may not prove to be the case. But I mean, it definitely makes sense to me that as a discipline, you want to have both tractable, immediate problems in your focus, but maybe also keep an eye on, on more long-range issues, like how will we eventually be able to scale this up to more complex or nuanced phenomenon that we know human beings actually exhibit. So maybe the value lies there in some compromise between the two.
I put myself on the speaker list also. One place where this relates to stuff that's familiar to me is that Aristotle said some years ago that what we should be looking at in ethics is to develop people's habits. Having the right habits is what matters for being a good person. It's not the ability to calculate in some way what is the right thing to do.
And people have been picking up on that in the last decade. So, and that seems consonant with the stuff that you're doing. One question which of course arises in that context always is, how do I actually do that? How do I acquire the right habits? And that's not so easy. Aristotle seems to say essentially that you just do it.
Right.
You just do these things several times, and then you go again, you'll have the form again.
Yeah.
And that's that.
Right.
Several people here, it seems to me, have pointed out that top-down control plays a role.
Yes.
So I'm still not so sure which book I should get. Because for one thing, I don't really have a huge influence on my environment. The thing which I was thinking of when you asked me about habit is shouting at my child. Now my child is behaving in silly ways. I cannot control that. So
Right.
neutralize the environment anyway.
Right.
So I probably have to start with me in any case.
Yeah.
And then I have to start with a top-down thing and say, okay, Vincent, calm down. Behave in this way. And if I do that several times, then I'll probably develop a habit. What is is there a different trick that we use for robots also?
Well, there's a lot in that, but let me just touch on a couple of things. So there are some interesting studies looking at how to accelerate the habit formation process, and there's just a few studies looking at that, and most of them use something called an implementation intention, which is basically the same as prospective memory. This is memory researchers call it prospective memory. So it's basically remembering to remember, right? And there are, so an example would be if I am going to go on a diet and I say, okay, I'm going to eat low-fat food, it's much more effective, instead of just saying I'm going to eat low-fat food, it's much more effective to form what they call an implementation intention and say, okay, when I go into restaurants and I open the menu, I'm only going to look at salad options. So if you specify the place and the action, the environmental setting and the action in advance, and you, in essence, rehearse that memory that then is going to be triggered in that setting when you encounter those stimuli, that has been shown to be a much faster way to establish the new behaviour, and if that's repeated sufficiently, it will become habitual. So that's one strategy that's been shown to be successful. But also, just let me clarify one point about the control. So it is that perhaps is confusing. So you were saying, well, wouldn't I need self-control to choose these strategies? And I absolutely agree with that. So I don't. Yeah, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that in choosing these two options that you wouldn't be engaging self-control in some way to set a strategy that involved either addressing the environmental cues or your goals and motivations. The point was more to say that, well, your actively chosen strategy should either engage with the bottom-up system or the top-down system, right? So there's a kind of meta perspective there. You can use active control, I believe, to use a strategy that you know is going to work with the bottom-up system. And I think that's what I would suggest.
That's what you would suggest, actually.
Yeah.
The popcorn is coming up, so... Jared, I think you want to say something.
Just a small thing about lunch. Lunch will be down here. It's ready. There are two soup buffets where you can get soup, and then there's one big buffet. There are two ways to deal with a situation like that. Either we stand in line all the time, or we try to avoid that table and go to a line when it's not too long. We're 1 hour and a quarter, so this time now. I suggest that you all do that. Thank you. See you back, by the way.